Sometime, the horror was all too real. Summer camp is supposed to be about making memories. But for a few unlucky souls, those memories are of pure terror. The threat wasn't some monster from folklore. It was something far more real. It was the person in the next cabin, the adults who were meant to protect them. Or something that stepped out of the shadows and defied all explanation. Tonight, we're looking at 3 true stories of summer camps that went horribly wrong. From a death that never should have happened, to a crime that has haunted a state for decades. And an encounter that proves the most frightening thing in the woods is the unknown. These are 3 unsettling real summer camp horror stories. Our first story is a tough one. It's not about ghosts, but about a very real monster, neglect. It's the story of a 15-year-old boy named Caleb Jensen, and the tough love camp that was supposed to help him, and instead led to his death. In 2007, Caleb Jensen was sent by a court order to Alternative Youth Adventures, a wilderness therapy camp in the rugged terrain of Montrose, Colorado. Like a lot of kids in these programs, Caleb had been in some trouble, and this was meant to be an intervention to get him back on track. His mother, Dawn, knew her son wasn't perfect, but she trusted the program would help his behavior, not end his life. She gave them his full medical history and made a special note that her son was highly susceptible to infections, a critical piece of information that was tragically ignored. The program was brutal. In letters home, Caleb told his family about hiking massive mountains and how exhausted he was. The core philosophy of Alternative Youth Adventures was to force at-risk youth through grueling physical challenges to build character. But for Caleb, it just broke down his body. According to a lawsuit his mother later filed, Caleb was forced to hike long distances at high altitudes, sometimes without water. The suit also claimed that staff took his shoes to keep him from running away, which led to cuts and bruises on his feet and legs. In this harsh and dirty environment, Caleb developed what started as a simple staph infection. It's a bacterial infection that's usually very treatable with basic medical care. But Caleb was miles from any road, deep in the wilderness with counselors who were reportedly trained to write off health complaints. They assumed kids were faking sickness to get out of activities. So, as Caleb's condition got worse, his pleas for help were dismissed. His symptoms became impossible to ignore. Other kids in the program started to worry, seeing that he was clearly sick and not faking it. And yet, the staff in charge allegedly didn't even bother to take his vital signs. Instead of getting medical attention, Caleb was just left to deteriorate. He was eventually confined to his sleeping bag, which became soaked with his own bodily fluids as his body failed to fight the raging infection. On May 2, 2007, only 35 days after he got to the camp, Caleb Jensen collapsed. He was found unconscious. By the time rescuers could get to his remote location, it was too late. Caleb was pronounced dead at just 15 years old. The autopsy confirmed it. He died from a staph infection that had been allowed to completely ravage his body. In the aftermath, the camp's license was suspended. A grand jury indicted the parent company, Community Education Centers, and several staff members on charges of criminally negligent homicide and fatal child abuse. But the legal battle got complicated. A judge threw out the indictment against the company because of technical issues with the wording. The company's lawyers argued that Caleb's death was a tragic event, but it was not a criminal event, and claimed his symptoms weren't obvious. Charges against most of the individuals were also eventually dropped. Caleb's family filed a civil lawsuit, which was settled out of court in 2013 for an amount that was never disclosed. His death shined a light on the dark side of the wilderness therapy industry, which often operates with very little oversight. Even worse, it was revealed that the operators of the camp had previously been cited by Utah's Department of Human Services for failing to provide proper medical care to another child. The very system that was supposed to help Caleb had instead sent him to a place where his life was worth less than the program's rigid and ultimately fatal ideology. A death caused by neglect is a tragedy. But when a case goes unsolved, the fear can fester for generations, leaving scars on an entire community. Our next story takes us to a summer camp in Oklahoma, the scene of a horrific crime from over 40 years ago. A crime that, to this day, has never officially been solved. Story 2. On June 12, 1977, busloads of excited young girls pulled into Camp Scott, a beloved Girl Scout camp in the woods of Mays County, Oklahoma. Among them were 3 friends from the Tulsa area: 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Heather Guza, and 10-year-old Doris Denise Milner. They were assigned to tent number 8 in the Kiowa unit, the most remote campsite, partially hidden and the farthest from the counselor's tent. That night, as a thunderstorm rolled in, the girls settled in for their first night of camp. But a sense of dread was already hanging over Camp Scott, even if no one knew it yet. Weeks earlier, during a counselor training session, someone found a chilling, handwritten note inside an empty donut box. In all caps, it read, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. The note was brushed off as a sick prank and thrown away. In the early hours of June 13th, around 1:30 a.m., a counselor named Carla Wilhite was woken by a strange sound. She later described it as a low, guttural moaning from the woods. After a quick look around, she decided it was just an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, around 6 a.m., that same counselor was walking to the showers when she made a horrifying discovery. On the trail ahead was a sleeping bag, and inside was the body of one of the little girls. A frantic search began. Counselors sprinted to Tent 8 only to find it empty. The other sleeping bags were gone. Soon, the bodies of all 3 girls, Lori, Michelle, and Doris, were found about 150 yards from their tent. They had been brutally assaulted and murdered. The camp was immediately evacuated, and a nightmare began for the families and the entire state. The investigation sparked one of the biggest manhunts in Oklahoma's history. The prime suspect was a man named Gene Leroy Hart. Hart was a local who grew up less than a mile from the camp. He was also a convicted rapist and a fugitive who had escaped the county jail 4 years earlier. For 10 months, authorities hunted for him, finally capturing him in a remote cabin in April 1978. The trial against Hart began in March 1979. The prosecution had evidence from a nearby cave Hart had been using, but the defense claimed it could have been planted. There was a partial fingerprint on a flashlight at the scene, but it wasn't clear enough to be a conclusive match. After just a few days of deliberation, the local jury returned a shocking verdict: not guilty. Though acquitted, Hart was sent back to prison to serve out the 305 years left on his previous sentences. He died of a heart attack in prison just 2 years later, in 1979, taking any secrets he had to the grave. For decades, the case went cold. The families had no justice, and a cloud of fear hung over the community. Camp Scott never reopened, but the search for answers didn't stop. In 1989, DNA testing was done on evidence from the scene. While it pointed toward Hart, the technology just wasn't advanced enough to be certain. Then, in 2019, thanks to fundraising by the local community, the evidence was sent for new, state-of-the-art DNA analysis. The results were finally revealed in 2022. Every single piece of identifiable male DNA found at the crime scene matched one person: Gene Leroy Hart. The testing ruled out every other person of interest. While the case will always remain officially unsolved, because Hart was acquitted and can't be retried, for the sheriff's office and the victims' families, the results finally gave them an answer. The boogeyman from that terrible night finally had a name. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about human monsters, but about something you just can't explain, a presence that shouldn't be there, an encounter you can't rationalize. If these stories are getting under your skin, consider subscribing for more tales from the dark. Your support helps us keep exploring these chilling cases. Now, our final story isn't a documented crime, but a personal account of something just as terrifying. A breach of safety in a place you're supposed to feel secure, but an intruder who was much more than just a stranger. Story 3. This story comes from a man looking back on his time as a young camper. It happened at a traditional summer camp, rustic cabins, campfires, and a dark, dense forest that seems to close in on you at night. For privacy, we'll call him Mark. One night, long after lights out, Mark and his cabin mate, David, were huddled under their blankets, whispering and playing on a handheld video game console. The only light in the cabin came from their tiny screens, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The other boys were all sound asleep. Outside, it was quiet, just crickets and the rustle of leaves. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open. Neither Mark nor David had heard any footsteps on the porch. The sound was so soft, so deliberate, they both froze. Hearts pounding, they instantly shut off their games, plunging the cabin into darkness. They lay perfectly still, just listening. A figure slipped inside, a dark silhouette against the faint moonlight in the doorway. The person moved with an unnerving silence, not like a clumsy kid or a counselor doing a bed check. This was a slow, methodical presence. Mark held his breath as the silent intruder moved between the bunks. He could hear the faint sound of soft footsteps on the floorboards, coming closer and closer to his bed. Then he felt it, a warm breath on the back of his neck. Pure terror seized him. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He just lay there, paralyzed with fear, pretending to be asleep as the figure stood over him for what felt like an eternity. He could feel its presence, a heavy, watchful stillness in the air. After a few agonizing moments, the figure moved on, finishing its silent patrol of the cabin before slipping back out the door just as quietly as it came in. Mark and David stayed frozen for what felt like forever, too scared to even whisper. When they finally did, they tried to make sense of it. A counselor? A prank? It didn't feel like either. The silence, the deliberate movement, that chilling moment of closeness, it felt wrong. Predatory. They were too scared to leave the cabin for help and just waited for the sun to come up, not sleeping a wink. The next day, they told their counselor. A search of the camp turned up nothing. Without any evidence, the incident was written off as a prank or a nightmare. The boys tried to move on, but the fear stuck with them. A few days later, as Mark was packing to go home, the true horror of it all became clear. He couldn't find his cell phone. He looked everywhere, but it was just gone. He figured he'd just misplaced it. But when he got home, his mother told him something that made his blood run cold. Someone had been calling their house. An old man's voice, asking for Mark by name. The calls had started the day after the incident in the cabin. The man, the stranger who breathed on his neck in the dark, wasn't just a phantom. He was real. And somehow, in those silent moments, he had stolen Mark's phone. And with it, a direct line into his life. The camp staff were told immediately. They searched again, this time with a real sense of urgency. But the mysterious old man was never found. No one knew who he was, how he got into a locked cabin full of sleeping kids, or what he wanted. He was never identified, never caught. For Mark, it was a terrifying reminder that sometimes the real monsters aren't just in stories. Sometimes they can open your door in the middle of the night. From the preventable tragedy of neglect, to the decades-long shadow of an unsolved evil, to the chilling violation of a silent intruder, the horror of summer camp isn't always in ghost stories. The most unsettling tales are the ones that are terrifyingly real, rooted in human failure, human malice, or the terrifying unknown. They remind us that vulnerability isn't just a feeling, it's a circumstance. And in the quiet isolation of the woods, far from home, that circumstance can have devastating consequences. The campfire is down to embers, and the stories are over. But the questions remain. What other tales are out there waiting to be told? If you found these stories unsettling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more explorations into the dark. Let us know in the comments which story stuck with you the most, or if you have a terrifying camp story of your own. Thank you for watching. Stay safe.